Hello, everyone. Today I'm joined with Dr. James Cooke for a different kind of podcast than I tend to do. Um, he's a neuroscientist, host of the Living Mirrors podcast, and as well author of a very good book, The Dawn of Mind. And thank you for giving me your time today. And I want to give you a little chance to sort of provide a little introduction as well to inform listeners of what you do and your work. And yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Great to be here. So I came to neuroscience after an awakening as a teenager, after a kind of spontaneous shift in consciousness. I say spontaneous in the sense that it wasn't triggered by meditation or anything like that, but it was triggered by a deep existential inquiry, a kind of need to figure out what was going on. And that kind of really broke my mind open in a way that I didn't know was possible. But it felt like insight. It didn't feel like going away. It didn't feel like stepping away from reality into some higher reality. It felt like seeing, people use words like the divine or wholeness or this kind of spiritual ways of speaking, but it was seeing this reality clearly for the first time, not shrouded by thought and distortion and delusion. And so because of that, there was this sense of like, well, science should be able to speak to this as well. This shouldn't just be something that is, whether a gatekeepers, like, I was raised Christian and, the priests were the gatekeepers. And this was a sense of a kind of radical revelation of the imminence of this stuff. And I was like, well, if it's right here for all of us to access, then science should be able to not kind of reduce it, not explain it away, but should be able to look at this reality from another standpoint. And we should be able to come up with a synthesis of science and spirituality. That's what led to becoming a neuroscientist. And then now I mainly do kind of public facing stuff like this, like trying to, because what always drew me was this desire for reckoning with our situation. And that wasn't like an intellectual thing just for me to do in private. That's something, that kind of calls to be shared. That's what I do now.
No. So from what I hear, it's like a lot of your direction in life seem to have as this orienting foundation from your mystical experience, or whether we can call it that, or basically this seeing clearly into the nature of reality as it is, kind of devoid of the sort of the spiritual and religious dogma, kind of something very real and unshakable. I want you to talk a little bit about what was it like? I mean, having this sort of awakening as a teenager. How did it affect your life afterwards? And what was the event as best as you can recall?
Yeah. So the core kind of insight, part of the reason I speak about this is because I'm at pains to communicate that. When we try and language it can sound very out there, very like, I had insight into reality itself, like grandiose. And the thing itself is so unbelievably simple. And really it's that thoughts, concepts work to seemingly divide up reality. I think I'm over here, you're over there. But that's all just ideas. That's a mental overlay. That's something the brain is doing. And if it stops doing that, it's profoundly obvious that reality is whole and that it's just a single unit of expression. And that comes first. That wholeness comes first. And then the mind, in Hindu traditions, they talk about, the veil of Maya, this kind of delusion. I think we can have kind of neuroscience of that, of why it is that for survival, we come up with these concepts of like, well, no, I'm a self inside this body and I'm different to you. And then there's this whole dynamic of separation that's a delusion. There is no kind of separation. That's really what we're talking about here. So everyone can see this. It's here all the time. The overlay is very thin, but it's robust. We have a lot of investment in our feeling of separation. So that's kind of what I mean when I say it's not about seeing some other reality that's different to this one. It is this one. We're just misperceiving it. The event itself was I was raised Catholic, and I was riding on a bus one day, and I was really, as I say, trying to reckon with our existential situation, partly because I guess I just had that orientation, sort of always had it. But being raised Catholic, the narrative that I would go to hell if I did for not having blind faith, I took very seriously. And I didn't understand. So I didn't have blind faith, but I wanted to, but I couldn't find it. And by definition, you can't get that through evidence. Then it wouldn't be blind. You can't reason your way that you just have to have it. So it was this kind of Zen koan paradox that I needed to have something that I couldn't have. I was trying to figure it out with the mind. But I couldn't step away from it, because to step away from it would have been ultimate insanity. Like if there's this ultimate threat of eternal damnation, like infinite pain, you can't just go, okay, well, I haven't figured that one out. I'll just do something else. I'll go play football now. That's to me, that seemed insane. So I wrestled with this until basically the mind gave up on a very, I think, very, very physiological level, just banging my head against the wall, again, like Zen practitioners do with koans. What's the sound of one hand clapping, that kind of thing. And yeah, then the thoughts stopped, and everything I've been saying was just so profoundly obvious that the one who struggles, the one who suffers, is an idea, is playing out in this dream of thoughts that pretends reality is separate, pretends there's a problem, pretends that there's someone who's going to die and that's a problem. It's all pretense. There's just the single indestructible energy of existence that is not going to go anywhere. When this body changes form, it becomes something else, and there's a total indestructibility to the essential nature of everything. And so in an instant, there was a sense of, oh, there's no problem here. There's no, it's not that my problems were solved. It's just they were actually never problems. They were a dream. They were ideas. And then the emotional momentum, the shadow stuff that keeps you locked in that paradigm came back. And then there was, a few decades of really intense trying to kind of integrate that. So that's kind of the broad strokes of the insight itself and how it came about.
Yeah. No, it's, I think, often people will talk about, spiritual awakening in these sort of, like you said, grandiose terms. People like to talk about, exploring other realities and sort of the extraordinary experiences. I think from hearing what you describe is speaking about, awakening as this very ordinary thing, as though you're seeing the extraordinary in the ordinary, and there's nothing new. There's no change really. It's only really a recognition of what already was, and it's like you said, it's our thoughts and our concepts that take us up into these sort of complex dreamed realities where we pretend that we are this separate character. We have a particular name. We are clearly defined and distinct from the rest of the world. But of course, these are all the stories that the mind generates to understand and comprehend our experience, and often they are they are conditioned into us from the society that we're brought up in. It's almost like a baby. They don't have a concept of object permanence. They have to learn and develop that, and it's almost like awakening. It's sort of it returns you back into that very infant-like or unconditioned state of perception, which if I were to assign various words or pointers to it, it's a very silent and still way of being. And it's again, it's people talk about it as ineffable, because it is ineffable. You can't grasp it with concepts, hence the use of Zen koans to sort of provide you paradoxes to get us out of that conceptual mode of processing, which very often is the root of a lot of our suffering. I want to talk to you, a bit further about, after that sort of initial spontaneous awakening, you talked a bit about the shadow work that entailed decades after that, and the difficulties of embodying that realization into your day-to-day life. So, if you could speak a bit to that.
Yeah, and thank you for your sharing on awakening. I agree with everything you said. And yeah, so this happened in my adolescence, early teens, and then I knew from like the literature, poets, and like novelists I was reading that Zen dealt with this terrain. And when I was like 19, I went to Himalayas, ended up in Nepal, but never really threw myself. I kind of, for some reason, didn't go that direction. I went the science direction instead. And then in my 20s, I kind of I started meditating, and these kind of direct path approaches to meditation where you're just kind of settling into the nature of the mind rather than, I did like 10-day Vipassana retreats and stuff as well. But I was trying to seek to bring these two things into alignment. The awakeness, the wholeness was always there when looked for, but there was always a collapsing back into the feeling of suffering. And so there was a desire for, how do I expand the amount of time I'm in the wholeness and the lack of suffering? And because the suffering was intense, and just knowing that it's not what it seems doesn't really take you out of it. It's very embodied, very real. If you're struggling with emotional stuff you don't want to face, then the struggle feels very real. So for a good decade and a half, I didn't really have maps. I didn't really know where I was going. I didn't know there was a possibility to really how far you could integrate this. And then in my late 20s, I started, I felt this desire to communicate this stuff and to share it with more people, because it was the most wonderful thing. It's the good news, it's the most wonderful thing in existence that there's a way out, and that it's right here, and that it's more real than everything else we take to be real. So I was, sorry, I've not long woke up. My mind's getting a bit fuzzy. I should lose my train of thought. So I was, I was reading papers on psychedelics and mystical experiences. I was thinking, well, this seems like an entry point for many people. I haven't heard of many people having the hell rumination awakening that I had. That seems to be quite rare. Meditation, lots of people meditate their entire lives and don't get to this terrain. But psychedelics seem to a lot of leading meditation teachers today are people who in the 60s tried LSD and then, saw there was something there. And so I became interested in the science. Also, it's a perfect way to talk about the science of this stuff. If you want a coherent picture of reality and you want to understand both the reality of these states, but how it's mediated, how the insight is mediated through the brain, they're an excellent place to work because they're a material substance that acts on a material brain that produces this transcendent experience. So I became interested in them, and I decided that I needed, in the studies, people were talking about mystical experiences. And there was a question as to whether these were equivalent to non-chemically induced mystical experiences like I'd had. And so I thought I should try a high dose psilocybin journey to see. And that was very illuminating and really confirmed the things we've been talking about concepts and the way that when they kind of melt away, the melting is kind of how they tend to shift in the psychedelics. Then the vision of wholeness and the stillness behind it all is there. So I felt I'd confirmed that, but then what I noticed was on the way up and on the way down, there was emotional content, autobiographical content. It was as if I was being taken from my usual embodied lockdown sense of self into this expansive space in a way that wasn't just mediated through awareness, like I was doing when I was shifting my attention into the absolute in my daily life through direct meditation. But this was a more embodied, being carried from where I was at to this place of surrender. And so I became fascinated with that and learned to use that as a way to see where I was holding, where I needed to surrender, where I was, where I was resisting reality. And that led me into, it turned out I was very traumatized, lots of very significant trauma. And I'd spent, several years really just going out there very hard in terms of intentional psychedelic sessions, body work. Somatics was a big part of it for me. And then I'll bookend that there, because after about 5 years of that, I opted out on the other side of that to boost to Cooke Dark Night of the Soul, which has a similar flavor, but we're still talking about the kind of the depths that it has. It's kind of a different chapter of the story.
Yeah, no, that's it's very, very interesting. I share like some, semblance of I started exploring psychedelics at a relatively young age in my adolescence, and that triggered for me an interest in mindfulness, meditation, Eastern philosophy, understanding the nature of reality, not from a sort of a more Western conceptual basis, but more from a direct, embodied, non-conceptual form of knowing.
Right.
As that led to Sarah's insights and stuff, but then, like you mentioned as well, the Dark Night of the Soul, which I think is very important aspect of, awakening to speak about. People often consider awakening as this, very immensely blissful, almost bypassing sort of terminology, but awakening at its core is, confronting truth, and often confronting truth can be intensely difficult. Psychedelics, they often will show you who you are, and in that process you will come to see, a lot of the mind that is often repressed, or you're dissociated from, like you sort of described. The psychedelic journey has this rhythm where there's this disintegration of the sort of more egoic, self-referential processes into this sort of ego dissolved state, which is, you're there flowing with everything, and that requires a sort of element of surrender. And then you also have after the peak of the experience, the reintegration, where, from my own experiences, as I recall them, that you'll have certain insights, revelations, thoughts, understandings about yourself, your traumas, your purpose, and these sort of deeper thoughts. And I think a lot of people tend to feel as though sort of psychedelics do allow you to sort of reconvene with yourself in a deeply sort of meaningful way. It seems as though perhaps, whether this is sort of an illusion of our thoughts, perhaps, but I can remember sort of, whether it's voices or my thoughts being infused with a sort of a deep sense of profundity, more than like sort of ordinary thoughts I tend to have. And I think when I sort of reflect on, my own journey through psychedelics, yes, I had certain spiritual realizations, but then there was, particularly when I was between ages of 21 to 23, a profound dark night period where, even though I'd had sort of an awareness of non-duality and all these sorts of stuff, I had a lot of unresolved traumas that spiraled me into a very intense sort of addiction phase and stuff like that. And that was an enlightening experience, I suppose, to sort of witness myself go through those sorts of changes. And it's sort of what's coming up for me is the sort of the different lessons that we learn through both bliss and also pain. And right. I've reaching the end of my trail there, but what sort of thoughts? Yeah, I want to ask you a bit about the Dark Night of the Soul, and
yeah. I think this path you mentioned about being kind of turning towards truth, and it's turning towards wholeness, you could say, at a deeper level, because by definition, the parts that we don't know of ourselves are the parts that are challenging. If there's most people aren't turning away from a pile of presents on the morning of their birthday as a kid, being like, no, this is horrible, I hate this. That's okay to accept into your narrative and your identity. There's no challenge there, but it's the difficult things by definition. And then we repress them so they become unknown as well. We don't know what we've put down there from our adult perspective. And so, yeah, it's a path of truth, wholeness, turning towards the unknown. So it's challenging. And you come up against, very, you can come up against very challenging stuff, but I think we only do this because of some deep longing for peace, wholeness, the stillness you mentioned. Pema Chodron refers to it as the outrageous courage of the Bodhi hearts. And like that phrase really resonates with me because something utterly outrageous about, like, James wouldn't have chosen to do this journey. It's like, it's not, the ego can't choose this. It pulls you from somewhere far deeper. And I think it's that, drive towards wholeness. And then I guess that actually takes me to the dark night of the soul. So the way that I'm using that phrase, is quite specific in that a more accurate phrase from Buddhism is the dukkha nanas, which is the kind of the knowledge of suffering. And there's a phase in kind of insight practice where basically you move from the autobiographical. When we're talking about shadow stuff, usually it's the kind of thing that can be put into words in terms of, oh, there's this memory of, something happened when I was at school, or there's this shame I experienced, or I'm still carrying. But this flavor is such, I guess when I was working with the shadow stuff, Western psychotherapeutic models were really helpful. When I got into the knowledge of suffering, I had to turn right back to Buddhism, to kind of early Buddhism, because you're dealing with resistance, basically, really in the bones, moment to moment, trying to get out of this moment, trying to reject this moment and say, no, this isn't, like, I've got to navigate to somewhere else. It turns out that's the basic game of suffering, is saying no to this moment. If you can fully, this is why mindfulness is the Buddha's prescription. Because if you can learn to just be here now, like the Ram Dass book, that's it. That's the path. And the complexity arises because, well, to do that, then you have to open to love and to integrate the shadow stuff. And so you can start to get into complexity. But really the point is to stop the egoic resistance, the struggle. And you mentioned surrender. Surrender into this moment, surrender into to seeing every part of yourself. But when you do that at the basic level of resistance, what you're really doing is letting the deep embodied self become integrated in a way that's kind of deconstructs it. So it really does feel like, it feels like an ultimate letting go. And once the burden of the kind of cognitive framework of a life falls, then it's wonderful and liberating. But as you're unpacking every inch of your co-attachments, it's wrenching. It's like, I think the main person who pointed me in this direction was Adyashanti, the American spiritual teacher. He's got a book called The End of Your World. And I don't think I would have known it was okay to go to this place unless if I hadn't read someone who'd said, no, like, this is how it goes, you can go here. I think the resistance probably would have just stayed. Who knows? But yeah, so it's really, it screws with your head, because it's like, we're talking about a kind of an abiding ego dissolution. Like, it's one thing to have a kind of ego death, ego dissolution on a psychedelic trip, but then at the end, some part of you knows you're going to come back and you're going to say, wow, I had a crazy experience. But when it's like, no, we're doing it now. Like, we're going to let go of all the attachments, and that would be it. That is basically the end of life, psychological perspective, from the one who feels like it lives inside the body, the self. It's the end of it. It's the unraveling of it. So yeah, it's really, and again, even people who think they are going to be okay in this terrain, there's some subtle way in which the mind is like, yeah, sure, I'll be okay with having a no self experience. It's like, no, that's not it. You are the one saying that is the one who's going to be like, wait a minute, I'm the one who's dissolving. I thought I would be somehow witnessing the dissolving. One way to think about it is, it's one thing to work with resistance, but it's another thing to discover that you are resistance. So like, in shadow work, you're letting go of the resistance at arm's length, but then that process takes you over until you are dissolving. And it turns out to be totally fine because you are just a thought. So this is the kind of cosmic joke where all that stress, all that struggle, all that questioning and resistance, I'm like, should I be doing this? This is like crazy. All that stuff just suddenly pops into like, oh, wait a minute, I'm just here. Like the dream evaporates and you're like, it was always just this moment. What's the problem? Like, why did I believe all that? And it's the believing the thoughts, the resistance patterns. It's really a kind of quite a perverse joke because it's like the way the mind works. Because it's, if you buy into it, then it's got you in its whole framework. But as soon as you divest from it, it's like, it's totally fine. But that divesting, as you're on your way out, the mind will be like, like it's almost like like a narcissistic, abusive, like part of the ego is like this kind of fearful craving. Like, no, let's keep staying in smallness and fearfulness. You won't be okay. Like you'll mess it up. You'll mess up your life. Like all this energy. And yeah, at some point you need to learn to kind of set a boundary. Hey, I'm not a big fan of demonizing the ego too much, but like when you notice that flavor, it's good to have the courage to say like, okay, this isn't nourishing. This isn't how I want to live the rest of my life, in fear and resistance and staying small. But it takes courage to jump off that cliff edge and discover that there is no, as someone says, like jumping out of an airplane, discovering there's no ground. And it is like that. The jump is, no matter how much people like me tell you there's no ground and it's fine and you're going to be okay, it's a different thing when you're on the edge of that airplane and the mind is like, can I, like, what if he's lying? What if everyone's lying? I'm just by myself up here. So there's no way around that courage, but it's wonderful when you actually do let go.
Yeah. No, it's yeah, I suppose it's sort of, it's for me it's interesting to understand how do I relate to the ego as a kind of an arising perhaps of sensation, whether it's fear or anxiety about the way something is going to happen. It seems as though the sort of ego often arises as a kind of anticipation for the future or a reflection of the past, or taking your sort of attention or your awareness out of what is ever present, the timeless now, whatever word we wish to point to it. And I can feel that sort of tension as a very bodily kind of feeling, whether there's sort of anxiety over taking a test or something like that, and you feel that knotting up in your stomach. Yeah. And or if you have social anxiety, and then it's like it's fear of the other person, and all this sort of ruminative cycling of thoughts with sort of it's your ego telling you that what is present right now isn't okay, and you need to be worried about it. You need to be stressed about it. That's the optimal response, which is absurd, really, because of course the optimal response or the optimal mode of being is one of peace and equanimity and openness to all outcomes, whether good or bad or this or that thing. Is kind of recognizing that that clarity and peace is already here, and you have thought it to not be present by your identification with being a character. Like I think currently I live with this sort of this awareness of being a character within a dream of mind, or the ego is aware of that perhaps, but then there's also the understanding that fundamentally I'm existence itself, or everything and nothing, or Brahman, source, God. And I suppose how this sort of tension has sort of affected my life is that I participate with a sense of reverence. I don't feel as though I am this little person. I feel like the universe through a particular focal point in this moment. And I suppose this experience is profoundly meaningful because you are realizing the inherent sacredness to everything around you and within you, and but it's also to take the leap to reach that point of complete reverence. You have to go through the dissolving of all those stories and fearful models and conditions that are part of this excessive identification with the character. I don't know. It's what do you feel about like you say, it's people fear that there is no ground when they take that final leap, but then you have to recognize that it's an illusion to think that there is a leap in the first place because you're already there.
Exactly. Well said. But the most pleasurable relative, it certainly feels like a leap. But yeah, so you're right to talk about that kind of knot in the stomach or like any contraction. The embodied aspect of self I'm talking about does show up as a contraction. You think down the kind of midline and the chakra system, or it's like ability to do things. I think it's going to turn out to be something. I mean, it is something very profoundly physiological, but it totally makes sense to me that an organism like us would just contract fearfully down the midline, and then when it releases, you would get kind of bioelectric waves going up into the body. I think I'm interested now I've been writing a paper for a while about trying to unpack that in kind of modern physiological terms. We'll see if that comes out at any point. So yeah, the issue when we show up in the world in a fearful, contracted way, the core issue is that we do think there is a thing inside us, an actually existing thing that isn't just the body, that will die, and that needs to be protected. So it's a bit like if you were a driverless car, but the driverless car was programmed so as to drive more effectively, it simulates a passenger. So it creates this like hologram of someone in the driver's seat, and it thinks this is someone really important who needs to be protected. And like if they're in a car crash, it would be bad. So the programming of the car is like, okay, like make sure you're really hyper vigilant, and because you've really got this hugely important passenger in the car. And then the spiritual path, especially something like self-inquiry, is like, we'll just have a look and see. And you're like, oh, actually, wait, there isn't anyone in the car. There never has been. And then what's there to do? Well, the driverless car just keeps driving, but does so with much more ease, and may even notice that it drives a bit better because it's not kind of jerking around and, but I think evolutionarily I think that simulating of a person, I think it really helps with development, where like if you're a baby and you're thirsty, you need to cry to get someone else to give you water. But once you've learned to drink water automatically, once your brain has those circuits by adulthood, sooner, then you don't need a self. The self is a psychological structure, process for learning, I think. So I think a natural stage of maturity as an adult is to just shed the illusion that there is someone. And that's, synonymous with that. It really does come down to death, because the you can't die because it was never born. And once that's seen, then what's there to contract about? Because, not just seen, but felt on a really embodied level, and you've let go of those contracted, fearful patterns. Because then in that situation, the reason we don't want to be embarrassed socially is because we're social primates who in the wild would have died if we'd been rejected by our group. So social rejection neurobiologically maps directly onto survival, fear of death. The same way we don't want to starve, but if you see that there is no one who will die, there's just a body which is made of the energy of existence, that it isn't even a strict boundary between, the oxygen molecules in the air are becoming my body right now. There's this constant, the body is just an energetic ripple in existence, a wave in the ocean. And the wave, a wave wouldn't get neurotically attached to it persisting as the particular wave it was, because it's not even it's changing all the time. Like, is this body the same body as me when I was 7? It's constantly changing. It's only that image of the driver's seat or the self that creates this whole framework of like, no, I don't believe you. There is a real problem here. There isn't a problem. The problem is imagined. And all the other problems are scaffolded at the top of that problem. So, on a relative, it doesn't negate the relative conventional level. We can still, I said how, the body doesn't want to die of thirst. And so you're not going to stop drinking water. You'll very much, like the driverless car that will just keep driving in a less neurotic way. You'll still drink water. You'll still have a preference to not die immediately. But if you were diagnosed with cancer after you've really integrated this stuff, what usually would happen, a lot of the suffering is the resistance to that. The whole narrative of like, no, this can't happen to me. Like, this is me. I'm the main character. My death is some ultimate metaphysical tragedy, instead of saying, oh yeah, like I was always going to die one day, and now it turns out it's happening sooner. Like, okay, like that I can, and again, not in like a numbing, bypassing way, but in a sense where you're like, wow, I can feel the heaviness of this. I'm feeling, you're just fully feeling, just not resisting. Because that you don't resist because you've seen that fundamental stance of thinking that someone who needs to be protected just isn't true.
Yeah, no, that's a lot of interesting threads to go down there. Particularly, the fear of death component, and the whole notion of death and the avoidance of death, and the sort of this desperation by which people try to reify and maintain this imagined driver of the car. And it's and as well, where I was listening to you speak, it reminded me of one of the central sort of findings from various psychedelic therapy sessions was sort of this sense of reduced fear of death, and this kind of increased acceptance of this sort of essential transitory period that we all have to go through. I think part of the fear of death is the fear of the unknown, the ultimate unknown, and we have different sort of ancient religious texts like the Tibetan Book of the Dead, for example, which sort of provide people as a kind of guidance on perhaps what to expect when we are sort of going through that process. I think psychedelics do provide a kind of a death before your death, a kind of experience of what is it like to experience a profound disintegration of all the various neuro modeling processes that are trying to simulate this sort of this separate driver, this this embodied self, particularly psilocybin does, LSD, DMT, perhaps quite potently, and I think if I'm only introspecting on my own experiences, that experiencing sort of intense, extraordinary disintegration of, say, like the visual field suddenly transforming, and suddenly your awareness is still there, which I find fascinating, even though everything you're perceiving is the dissolving of solidity to sort of a more field-like electrical kind of experience. And it's whilst psychedelics do not give you that sort of fully actual death, they can provide you sort of a representation of perhaps what it may be like, and I think that provides people with this sort of sense of like, I am not just my body, in my essential nature. So death is perhaps, not as significant as my sort of ego thought it to be. Death is perhaps just another stage, perhaps like it's just something going beyond. And I guess that leads into sort of discussions of reincarnation as a sort of metaphysical understanding of like, what is going on here, but
I feel like there's a kind of you could say that there's maximal reincarnation all the time, in the sense that because there's not a self, it's totally an illusion to think that there's somebody different that you have to be it's just the one with multiple perspectives on itself. And so you could tell yourself a story: when this body dies, another body will be born somewhere, and it's reassuring in that linear sense. But then why not do that right in this moment and say, when this body dies, the universe will be looking at itself through all these other eyes, non-human, human, So I think that's kind of the deep insight of reincarnation.
Yeah. It's interesting to sort of speculate, and as I sort of recall back to sort of my dark night of the soul, and experience of like intense sort of addiction, and part of during that phase of my life I would have these sort of panic attacks, which, if anyone who knows what a panic attack is, it's initially when you've never had one, they feel almost like a heart attack. And I remember the sort of symptoms, and I can remember sort of, there's questioning of mortality, and it was in a very intense sort of experience. But it was also, quite a revelatory experience, because, that changeless awareness is still there, whilst, the body is in this intense, fearful state of, fear about its continuity. A sort of essential, simple, silent, primordial awareness is it's always there, through both bliss and pain and trauma. It's always there. Whether you call it the watcher or the observer, these are all just terminology, I suppose. But it's a
way I really advocate to. I come from Minio. We've done the system, so the opposite of a panic attack, really. So, for me at least, I spent a lot of my life not being dialed into my body, to my stress levels, to spectrum of kind of dissociation when stressed or triggered. And once I started to do that and use kind of breath work and body movement to start to really discharge trauma and traumatic energy, that was really a game changer. And so, one might learn these techniques if one is having a panic attack. You might say, well, how do I get back to some relative baseline? But from relative baseline, it allows you to surrender more deeply if the body can let go in a way where it feels resourced, so it's okay, I've learned these skills so I can, for me, when I did my therapeutic psychedelic work, effectively, it was quite mundane in the method I used, but it was really put myself in a safe environment. Like the room I'm in now is safe enough, it's just, obviously the world's fundamentally unsafe. You don't know if something, something is going to suddenly happen, but generally, if you're at home and you can say you're pretty safe, and phone off, and then just really in that situation, I would turn towards whatever was most challenging. And I would know that the anxiety that came up wasn't to do with my current situation. It was a memory from the past. It was traumatic energy. So I was in a safe enough environment that I could just discharge it in that moment and say, okay, this isn't here now. I'm going to connect with the safety where I currently am, shake it out. I did a lot of tremoring. David Baselli's trauma release exercises were really powerful for me. And then you're kind of moving the system into the opposite of a panic attack, which I think is, the panic attack is part of that kind of stress physiology premised on the self that feels under threat. And then this is the opposite. This is the dissolution of, coming into union. And then when you mentioned how the visual field can kind of deconstruct separation with psychedelics, and one of the ways I like to kind of facilitate awakening and non-dual investigation, people can try this now, is just kind of with eyes open, take in the visual field, kind of with a dilated, effortless awareness. And then you could move attention to bodily sensations, which would be kind of like a cloud of sensations. And then when you see any part of your body, so right now I can see my knee, but it might just be your nose if you're standing up, or your arms. You can inquire as to is that inside or outside? Because it's a visual appearance that seems to be part of the visual world that I say is outside, but it's my body. So you can move attention through. You can think of this almost as one channel of awareness with body vision, bodily sensations, visual appearance, and you're kind of just moving attention backwards and forwards, and you can have this radical shift, as kind of happens with psychedelics, where it becomes really clear this is all happening in one awareness. There aren't different channels of awareness for different bodies and different sensory modalities. This is all just arising in awareness. But I preface that with, for some people, that direct pointing can produce dissociated, stressy states, which is actually a sign you're moving in the right direction and the body is trying to surrender and process stuff. So that's why I mentioned the grounding things, if that's happening for anyone. You can go to innerspaceinstitute.org and there's some grounding practices there on the Essentials course. It's free. So just breath work, vagus nerve breathing, where you just breathe 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out, stuff like that. You can start to learn to regulate your nervous system. For some people, it might not produce, don't know anything. But that kind of inquiry where you're just looking into experience in the present moment, seeing through, inquiring into the separations that you think are there and discovering they're not actually there, like the driverless car, scanning and looking for the driver and discovering it's not there. Self-inquiry is another version of this, looking inside for where do I think I am in awareness? Am I inside my head? I can't seem to find myself. All I find are thoughts and sensations and visual appearances. But doing that in this surrendered, open, relaxed way. To me, that was really the path through all these different complexities of, psychedelics and yoga and body work and shadow work. It was really came down to this surrendered inquiry, this relaxed, open, effortless, but engaged, dialed in investigation into one's true nature.
No, that's very, very interesting. Yeah, and I want to ask you a bit about what you're doing with the Inner Space Institute, what sort of things that you're offering to people, and I know you, from what I've seen, a bit of like guided meditations, certain retreat sessions, and then I think that'd be a good place to sort of
Thank you. So the approach I just described is really the core, the kind of beating heart of this kind of non-dual awakening stuff. So I mentioned there's a free essentials course. There's a membership option if you want to access a kind of whole library of practices and weekly calls and things. You can also sign up for that. You can get a free account if you can't afford it. I don't want it to be kind of aggressively paywalled, but if one can, it helps support it and grow the mission if people can donate. And then so I live in Portugal. We've got a retreat center that's almost finished. So maybe next year, 2026, we'll be running retreats. Again, structured around this kind of non-dual self-inquiry, very much influenced by the direct path teachings of things like Zen. We have things like non-meditation, where you just surrender and just be present. So there's quite a few exciting projects going on in the background there, some research papers coming out. The idea is to ultimately validate these methodologies and to have a kind of feedback cycle where they are already evidence-based, but then we validate, test them, and have a cycle where they just become more and more effective. So the aim is to really create a kind of an approach to the contemplative path that is grounded in first principles thinking from science and philosophy, and it doesn't rely on dogma, but does draw on the world's contemplative traditions to create this kind of synthesis of approaches that aligns with neurobiology. So that's really what I've been working on. And it's in its kind of, it's gestational at the moment. It's kind of finding its feet. So if that sounds fun, people can be part of the early kind of cohort there, but it's going to be expanding and moving more and more in that kind of direction.
No, it's a lot of very interesting and important work, and I think your work, it stands to this intersection, this modern intersection of science and spirituality. You as well mentioned the sort of a paper you're doing. It's regarding the sort of the physiology of the Kundalini sort of awakening, which I think very interesting. I think I'd like to read that paper and sort of bridging these different approaches, the science empirical method of looking outwards and measuring versus the more introspective, internal, contemplative sort of traditions. And I think it's very important work that needs to be done. And I want to sort of respect your time and sign off here. And I thank you for joining and giving me your time here. I very much enjoyed this conversation. It's been very insightful for me. And thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Ryan. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. I'll stop there.